Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the Daily Mirror's political editor, Pippa, Crerar, and the associate editor for politics at the Daily Telegraph, Christopher Hope. Welcome to both of you. So to the front pages then, let us start with the Telegraph. The biggest rail strike in Britain in 30 years dominates most of the front pages. Telegraph reporting that Boris Johnson has rejected the RMT's demands for a pay rise of at least 7% and dismissed suggestions by union bosses that fares could pay for it. The Daily Mirror reports that millions of Britons are facing travel chaos as railways grind to a halt, flights are cancelled and petrol prices keep on rising. As it says, the Transport Secretary refuses to do anything. Union bosses are warning that rail workers will strike for as long as it takes. That is on the front page of the Metro. The Prime Minister plans to allow firms to bring in agency staff to relieve the effect of the rail strikes. That's according to The Guardian. Britain runs into the buffers is the headline for The Times, which says the strikes will disrupt exams, medical treatment and those heading to the Glastonbury Festival. The Daily Mail says the RMT union is accused of punishing millions of innocent people by pressing ahead with the walkouts, which will force towns and cities into lockdown. The FT reports that industry leaders say the walkouts will hit firms still struggling to recover from the financial impact of COVID hardest. And away from the rail strikes, the Eye leads with Downing Street asking ministers to ease restrictions on city bosses' pay in a bid to show overseas companies the benefits of Brexit. And the Daily Star makes clear how it feels about Dominic Raab being in charge of the country while the Prime Minister recovers from a minor operation. Well, a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch the programme. So let us go to our guests then, the Daily Mirror's political editor, Pippa Crerar, and the associate editor for politics at the Daily Telegraph, Christopher Hope. Welcome to both of you. So a minor operation, Christopher, for the Prime Minister, but he's back, expected at Cabinet on Tuesday, with words from him in the newspapers. What's he likely to say about the rail strikes, which start at midnight?
Well, it's very clear that the government, the Tory government, led by Boris Johnson, see this whole battle as almost akin to the miners' strike in the 1980s. They see it as a massive wedge they can drive between their core support, Tory support, and they would see it as support for Labour, because many Labour politicians have been quite loath to criticise the strikers tomorrow. So as we go back to working from home for many people, others can't get to exams. It's a way of trying to the government to try and put the focus back onto Labour and ask what they're doing to condemn these strikes.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the wheels are falling off, does it not? If you listen to the news today, Pippa, the Metro goes with that. It's all going a bit loco. Mayhem for commuters as the rail strike starts. Firms face crippling losses, this paper says, as those talks fail. You've got the airline issue as well. Petrol prices going up. You know, it becomes et cetera, eventually, doesn't it? So how do you, I mean, more broadly, how do you see the state of the UK right now?
Well, I think, Anna, you're right in describing it as chaotic. It isn't, of course, just the rail strikes coming up, it's transport across the board. And while the government, as Chris rightly says, has sort of identified this as a potential wedge issue with people, I think it's underestimating the public. Of course, nobody wants disruption and strikes to have to go ahead. Nobody wants children to miss their exams, or people to struggle to get to work, or businesses to suffer, or indeed music fans not to be able to make it to Glastonbury later this week. But I think the blame for this will very quickly move from striking railway workers, if there is blame there in the first place, to the government for overseeing this chaos, not just on the railways, but in other areas of transport. There's obviously lots of disparate reasons for why, for example, petrol prices are going up, and why there's sort of baggage handling issues at Heathrow. I gather they've cancelled more flights tonight. But ultimately, the public will be looking for somebody to come in and actually do something. And for Grant Shapps to turn around and point the finger at Labour and say, well, you know, they're not condemning it hard enough. They're not getting involved. It's like, well, they're the opposition, mate. You know, it's down to the government to actually to step in. And while the government has said thus far the government said thus far that they don't want to because it's down to the train operating companies. I think very quickly the public will turn and demand some sort of leadership. After all, they are supposed to be leading the country.
Go on, Christopher.
Well, I'm not entirely sure that's right. I think we've got so used to the government stepping in over 2 years into the COVID crisis. The Tories might say, well, why should the government step in? It's not really a debate between the government. It's between these rail operating companies and their unions. At some point, the government should say, this isn't our fight. Yes, I know we as a government would own the tracks, the rail tracks. We're not in charge of this dispute. It's a battle between unions and their employers. And maybe the government shouldn't step in because the government will get little credit for doing so.
But the argument is that the government is effectively the paymaster for much of this. You'd heard Mick Lynch as well, the RMT General Secretary, saying that, that the fingerprints of Sunak and Shapps are all over this deal, effectively blaming government for not allowing a deal to take place. So, as somebody who funds a lot of this, and indeed funded through COVID, which was the boast of Grant Shapps today, Christopher, they are a stakeholder, aren't they?
They're certainly a stakeholder, but I've been talking to Tories today who have been saying to me, why on earth should the government be involved? Yes, we allow these network rail, these companies to run the services, but really it's up to them to work out how much they pay their staff. It shouldn't be up to us. And I wonder whether this is a line which the government will draw and say, at some point, the government's got to retreat from our everyday lives and get out the way.
So staying out of this does not make this not difficult, if I can put it that way, for the government. The Daily Telegraph, quoting the comments released to the media before Cabinet on Tuesday from Boris Johnson, too high demands on pay will also make it incredibly difficult to bring to an end the current challenges facing families around the world with rising cost of living. Boris Johnson, of course, Pippa, the very man who sold the benefits of high wages as part of the Brexit dividends. And the other difficulty is the urging of other sectors to follow. Mick Lynch, pictured there in the Telegraph, urging teachers, nurses and doctors to follow the lead of striking rail workers. So that starts to get very difficult, doesn't it?
Well, this is right. The Prime Minister, of course, has said that he wants a high wage economy. And only a month ago, Number 10 decried the Bank of England governor who suggested that there couldn't be inflationary pay rises, or there shouldn't be inflationary pay rises for public and private sectors. And then we had Simon Clarke, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, on the morning round today, saying that people can't expect inflationary pay rises. I mean, the reality is that inflation's looking like it's approaching 11%. And in this particular dispute, the rail operating companies have agreed to go up to 3%. People right across the board, not just public sector workers, private sector workers as well, are really struggling with cost of living. And many of them don't understand why they aren't being offered as they would regard it, a fairer settlement to help them directly with that cost of living crisis. The government's position, obviously, is that that actually pay rises could end up making inflation even worse, even higher. And that's why they don't want to do it, because of what they regard as the sort of more structural economic damage that could inflict. But it isn't just the RMT. The RMT are kind of like, the front line, if you like, of these strikes. And it's really interesting to see what the government's approach is going to be, because ultimately, if the RMT and the rail strikes are successful in terms of getting a higher pay settlement, then I think you can see other unions following suit. Many of these public sector workers, of course, have experienced real terms pay cuts over the last decade. Many of them are now seeing, as in the private sector, of course, union members are in the private sector as well, really sort of below inflation rises, which will really not touch the sides when it comes to dealing with the rising cost of living. And you may well see other sectors that have traditionally been on very low pay, nurses being a prime example, but teachers and other NHS staff too, being balloted. In the NEU, the education union, is planning on balloting its members, and then Unison as well, which represents many hundreds of thousands of NHS workers, is also said it would consider strike action.
Yes,
should it need to in order to get higher pay.
and this idea of allowing firms to bring in agency staff, this is the Guardian that's picked up on this, a move that the paper says unions decried as unworkable, unsafe and potentially breaking international law. And certainly the business secretary tweeted, didn't he, repealing these 1970s era restrictions will give businesses the freedom to access skilled temporary staff at short notice. Legislation is on its way. Many people pointing out, well, what was the difference with P&O bringing in agency staff? So, I mean, which the government was very firmly against, we remember, Christopher.
Well, I think that's a very, very fair comment. I think that this is exactly what the government were against, bringing in all those new staff in P&O when they sacked the entire workforce and brought in cheaper labour who were brought to get the services back. I mean, I think it's fair comment. I mean, I think this is. I'm not sure this really helps, this kind of language, when they're trying to get an agreement between two sides in an employment dispute to talk about bringing in strike breakers.
And the FT talking about business fears of the cost of all of this, the cost and longevity of action, I guess, as well, because who knows how long this goes on for and how many sectors it permeates into, Pippa. That's the FT.
Yeah, I mean, this is the biggest real strikes in a generation. And as we've already discussed, it could go into other sectors. And Mick Lynch has made it quite clear that he sees this as being a sort of a long-term dispute. They're obviously sort of doubling down and settling in. I think we're likely to see more strikes beyond over the next few days, Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, potentially reaching out into the summer. And as you said, spreading to other sectors. So there's obviously going to be a big impact of this on business beyond any potential pay rises, settlements that they have to reach. It's also obviously could impact things like leisure and tourism and theatre. FT suggesting that could be a hit of more than £1 billion. So it's not a happy situation. Not just for the rail operating companies, but also business and industry more generally.
I would say that the big gamble that the government's taking on this is it's a strike during the summer when many commuters may be happier working from home if they're in white-collar jobs, if they're lucky enough to be able to do that. And the hope is maybe that it can be mitigated that way, and it could be a difficult. They can get through the summer, and not that many people will notice that the chaos caused.
Yeah, indeed. So those lucky enough to work from home. Not necessarily the hospitality sector or shops and, very many people who have to come to work. So divisive in some respects, I suppose, for them. But we'll keep a close eye on that. Plenty more, though, still to come, including this story on the front of the Telegraph. Lord Guide, Carey claims are ripe for an investigation. There's the suggestion. Back with that in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me once again, the Daily Mirror's political editor, Pippa Crerar, and the associate editor for politics at the Daily Telegraph, Christopher Hope. Welcome back to both of you. Pippa, talk us through the I then. Number 10, the paper says, plans to tear up the limits on city bosses' pay. Remind us, was this rules that were brought in after the financial crisis?
Yeah, so it actually stems from us being a member of the European Union, but after the financial crash in 2008, there was a plethora of regulations which were brought in because, of course, one of the feelings was that high city pay and big bonuses encouraged financial workers to take big risks, some of which ended up being major factors in the financial crash. And so regulation was tightened up across the board. This wasn't unique to the EU, and I don't suppose it would have been, Britain would have done it regardless of whether it was a member or not. However, it was tied to being a member of the European Union. And as we know, there is a real drive, a real push in government at the moment, championed by Jacob Rees-Mogg, but there are others too, to try and show the benefits of Brexit, because of course the economy is struggling a bit. We have seen very low growth, potentially going to tip into recession. And while there are many international factors, such as the war in Ukraine, China and supply chains as a result of the pandemic, it's definitely the case that the government's looking for some sort of big, significant benefits of having left the European Union, rather than sort of, things which are perhaps regarded as symbolic but less significant, like weights and measures and and so on. So what they're suggesting is in this letter, which was sent by Steve Barclay, who's Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, but was a former Brexit Secretary, to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, it's been leaked to the Eye, and it suggested reducing the burden on business to make London a more attractive financial centre internationally, to try and encourage people to come here post-Brexit. And things like the cap on bonus pay could be lifted. Currently it's a cap of 100% of your salary, or indeed some of the other limits that are put in place in terms of how you pay bills and so on.
Sorry to interrupt. You've got a couple of other stories I want to get to, which both your papers are going with, actually. Front page of the Mirror, shameless PM tried to get Carrie 2 jobs, and the front of the Telegraph as well. Down the bottom there, Lord Geit, the outgoing ethics advisor, believes that allegations that Boris Johnson attempted to appoint his future wife to a senior government job could be ripe for investigation, Christopher.
Yes, I think this is fascinating. It shows what a wasted resignation Lord Geit's was last week, when he could have resigned over this story at the weekend in the Times that Boris Johnson looked at hiring Carrie as chief of staff when they first got together. I mean, he's now indicating that he would like a future person who may or may not replace him. We don't even know whether that's going to happen yet, because the PM may not replace him at all. Should investigate it. It just shows it's an odd story, this one. It was you probably covered it over the weekend, but I think there's lots of shock and horror about it. But I'm not sure quite why. You've got here a Prime Minister who did look at trying to get donor money in to help out with the home furnishings, the decorating in Number 10. How far removed from that is it to try and give a job to his other half in government? Then it was turned down by the people. I mean, I think this is the kind of par for the course for many people for Boris Johnson.